You're listening to 94.4 FM, Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate in this guest to have a wide range of guests on this show, ranging from the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, trainers. A lot of people have been on the show to give us some insights, and one of the goals of the show, or a couple of the goals of the show, is increasing sporting awareness and participation. And equally, we've had our new segment that's not so new now, it's been going on for a while, where we've interviewed some of the world's leading people in the field of psychology and related fields to raise mental health awareness and to sort of discuss developments in the area of mental health. Today, we have a fascinating guest who's going to sort of talk about development in the field of cricket, which is a sport that's we've seen England and Wales do really well in the last few years, and over the last few years we've seen success of the World Cup and many other things really. So we'll get more of an insight into what it takes to be a cricket player at the highest level. So our next guest, Nathan Wood, is a performance mentor and coach developer, amongst other things. He also has a role at the England and Wales Cricket Board as a lead of specialist international coach development. He's been in coaching development for a long time. I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about what he does and a bit more of an insight into how to develop performers in cricket. So welcome to the show, Nathan Wood. Great to have you on board.
Nice to be on board, Jim. And when you say I've done it a long time, are you saying that I'm old?
Yeah. So you've been around, but no, I mean, it's sort of great that you've been sort of working in this sort of field. And I think, I suppose where we sort of can start is, how did you get into it, Nathan? Our listeners are probably wondering how you sort of got into doing what you do now. What sort of got you involved into sort of the coaching side of things?
Okay, well, it started when I was a young boy. So my dad actually was a professional cricketer himself. So I was introduced to it at a very early age. It was basically all I knew, Jim, to be honest. My mum didn't work. All the friends of the family were cricketers or sports people, and I spent most of my kind of leisure time in and around cricket matches. So I kind of grew up with cricket as being a major part of my life, and then I became a cricketer. I kind of went on the junior pathway, played for the young England teams. I joined Lancashire when I was 18, and I did that as a professional for about 8 years. But during that time, back in those days, cricketers kind of had 6-month contracts, which meant that you had to do something in the winter. And what I did in the winter was I worked for the club as a coach. That was quite an interesting introduction to coaching, because they used to send me out into primary schools where they didn't play any cricket, and I was expected to kind of get 20 or 30 young children involved in the game and to have a bit of fun. So that was where I started my coaching education. Through playing.
So you had that sort of first-hand playing experience, and you were in a sporting sort of family and environment. What I find really interesting is from the perspective that you sort of worked at different age groups. So you mentioned there, obviously how you sort of got into it. So you, when you worked at Lancashire, for example, you worked at different age groups. What was it like working with different age groups in cricket? I mean, our listeners, we have a wide range of listeners who follow different sports, but in terms of cricket, say, how do you develop youngsters, say, from the age of 13 all the way to teenage years? Do you have like a specific model in place? How does that sort of work, Nathan?
Yeah, so in cricket we have a performance pathway, which kind of starts around about 12 or 13, where identified youngsters will be put on that pathway. So each county, of which there's 18 first-class counties, but 39 national counties. So for your listeners, a first-class county is a county that has a fully professional team. So that would be something like Lancashire or Surrey, Yorkshire. Then you have what you call national counties, where they will be kind of semi-pro. So, in all, you've got, 40, 50 counties that cover the country, and they will each have their own performance pathway where they identify young kids, and they'll give them some winter training, they'll put on a match programme, they'll get them competing in matches against other counties, and then round about 15, 16, those promising youngsters will be identified for potential academy roles within the counties. So each of the 18 first-class counties has an academy, and they're kind of the next cabs off the rank in terms of professionals. So the cream of the academy will then probably sign a professional contract at one of those counties, and then then they become professionals in that one.
Are they, at what point are they full time? Are they full time? Do they get do they sort of train every day, or is it sort of part time?
The academy plays, that's the part time role.
Okay.
They'll probably start playing a bit of reserve cricket, so that each county obviously has a professional team and then a reserve team. We call it a second team in cricket. So those academy lads will get some experience playing in some of those second team matches, and they will probably do a bit of touring in the season, going from county to county, living in hotels, but getting a bit of a glimpse into what it's like to be a professional player. That's
fascinating stuff. And obviously, if you're around sort of professionals and you're around that sort of environment, it can be either inspiring, but I suppose it can be daunting as well. And is it sort of really important from a development point of view that they've got sort of players to mentor them, to sort of help them along the way as well as the coaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you learn from everybody, don't you? And if you've got people around you who are inspiring, who have good habits themselves, who work hard, who show you the optimum way to practice, and that's going to rub off on the young players. But conversely, when I played, which was a long time ago, I played for Lancashire in the 90s basically, and that second team, when you went into that second team environment, there were a lot of people who were disillusioned because they weren't in the first team, and so their habits and behaviours perhaps weren't the most, the best for a young player to learn. So these guys are impressionable. They'll go into this environment, they'll be a bit daunted and excited, and what they see, they will probably take on board and copy, try and imitate. So it's important that those environments are sound, and they do some good.
Yeah, and obviously Lancashire's produced some great cricketers, and it's a strong county. And how have you sort of seen things change yourself at that county level over the years? Obviously you played in the 90s at county level. Was it changed a lot in terms of the game, the training methods? I've sort of seen some cricketers up close. They seem to be, I don't know what it was like back in the 90s, but certainly now we're sort of seeing some really fit athletes, strong athletes. They sort of keep themselves in shape, and has it changed the game in terms of training, Nathan, would you say, or has it just progressed along the way?
I think it's changed massively. So I signed my first professional contract in 1992, and I think, as I alluded to earlier, the first 3 or 4 years that I had as a pro, it was 6-month contracts. You kind of turned up a month before the season in March. We didn't have any fitness trainers. What we did have was a physio, and it was a guy called Laurie Brown, who used to be the physio at Manchester United before he came to Lancashire. And he basically just took us on a couple of laps of Stretford and Old Trafford, and that was it. Yeah. And then probably halfway through my 10 years as a professional player, we then went on to 12-month contracts, and then we started getting a bit more professional. We had a fitness trainer come in, and the first one I remember was a guy called Steve Hansen, who was a rugby league player.
That's right.
He was just nuts. Guy, but he trained us as rugby people, as rugby players, not cricketers. But now, fast forward 20 years, however long it's been since I finished, you know, you look at the backroom staff of a professional cricket team and it's unrecognisable. You have, you know, numerous strength and conditioning coaches, you've got masseurs, you have physiotherapists, psychologists, biomechanics, all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot more professional than it used to be.
Absolutely, it's really interesting you say, and the sort of recent Test series, England versus the West Indies, we sort of saw the likes of Broad. I nearly said Chris Broad, then Stuart Broad, and Anderson. You know, at the sort of obviously, you know, Broad makes a point of being a few years younger than Anderson, but equally when you think fast bowlers and when you look at the list of like leading wicket takers, you think, well, you know, back in the day you had some great fast bowlers, but obviously they didn't sort of play for as long as they can do now. And do you think training has had a big impact on that in terms of the biomechanics and in the economy of movement and the sort of training they do now, like the sort of Pilates and muscle balance stuff? Has that been a big factor for the fast bowlers, do you think, Nathan? Or
I think fast bowling is really fascinating in cricket because if you look at all the other aspects, batting, keeping, fielding, you know, the athleticism has certainly increased the skill level of those attributes. I think with fast bowling, you know, our fast bowlers are fitter and stronger than ever before, and yet they still break down. You know, compare. I mean, if you look at, you know, some of the greats who had really long careers, you know, Courtney Walsh, Curtly Ambrose.
That's right.
Going back to, you know, a bit further, Dennis Lillee. I mean, these guys played for a long time, played a lot of cricket. And they didn't have the fitness regimes that our fast bowlers have today. And yet, you know, have they kind of improved their injury rate? Probably not, you know. So it's a really fascinating topic. I don't know why it is, but it seems that we haven't quite got there in terms of optimum S&C for fast ball. I think we're going in the right direction, but absolutely. Got the answers.
It's a difficult one, I think, because obviously the sort of the actual demands of being a bowler as well. I mean, obviously, if you from a biomechanical point of view, you know, steaming in at full speed and obviously, you know, the movement to do the bowling action too is a big thing too. And but like he says, I mean, sports science can take us so far, but obviously there's still a lot to be learned in that area as well. In terms of yourself, so you know, when you sort of you've worked with players, younger players, and what do you look for in a player? I mean, one thing that sort of strikes me, Nathan, is sometimes you get players play domestic cricket and they're literally unknown. Not unknown, obviously they've got the ability, but they kind of just burst on the scene, so to speak. I mean, what do you look for in a player yourself in terms of, okay, this guy's got talent type thing?
Well, the first thing I look for is desire. You know, I think if you've got the desire, then it gives you the fuel to be able to put in the necessary work that you have to keep improving. You know, once you become a professional and you get into the public eye, the first thing that happens is that the scrutiny on you becomes so much greater. You know, you've got cameras on you, you've got performance analysis kind of coming up with lots of game plans that show your weaknesses. So if you don't have that desire to keep improving your game, then, you know, I don't think that you can have longevity in the game, is my personal opinion. Obviously, you've got to have some kind of certain level of athleticism because, you know, cricket, like any sport, is, you know, athletic movement. And then you've got to have the fundamentals of the discipline that you have, whether that's batting or bowling or whatever it is. Now, a lot of experts, you know, disagree on what those fundamentals are. But if you strip them back, you know, there's only a handful. You know, when it comes to batting, it's you know, can you make contact consistently? Can you bat long periods of time? Can you know, score in a range of areas? So I would say desire, technical competence, or you know, a certain level of skill and athleticism. And then the final thing would be, you know, some kind of resilience, you know, psychology, is so important in what we all do, actually. You know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Regardless of whether it's sport or business or any field, you know, any kind of action is preceded by a thought, and thought comes under the realm of psychology. So, you know, you have to have resilience and some kind of. I don't like the term mental toughness because I think it leads people into hot water. But I prefer something like mental flexibility. You know, being able to adapt and flex. To certain situations.
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting point you make there, and I think it's also concentration in cricket too. Like, so for example, if you're fielding in the slips or a wicket keeper, and you have an opportunity to sort of take a catch or a run out, and to be able to sort of focus at the right time. And what's that like in terms of developing players? I mean, do you sort of keep an eye on that when you're developing players to see how well they can concentrate at specific moments where I can imagine it can be easy to switch off at times because you're on the field for a long time, and obviously there are other sort of things going through your mind. But do you sort of work on that area, sort of concentration, the focus area? What are your sort of thoughts around that area, Nathan?
So it's absolutely key. I remember. So in the matches that I played at Lancashire, when I opened the bat with Mike Atherton, who was the then England captain, he was famed for his concentration levels.
Yeah.
Now, when I first came into the team, if I batted for a period of time, I was absolutely exhausted, whereas he just didn't seem to be that tired. And speaking to him and others, it suddenly dawned on me that actually, to be able to concentrate for a long period of time, cricket can last six hours in a day, so to concentrate for that period of time, actually, you said it's really important that you're not on all the time, that you actually manage it and that you dial up and down. So Mike Ellison was very, very good at switching on when the bowler was coming in, but as soon as he played the ball, his mind went off and he relaxed, whereas somebody like me, as a inexperienced player coming in, I was on all the time, so my battery drained quite quickly. So concentration is. I heard a lovely phrase from Jonathan Trott years ago. He said that concentration is the absence of irrelevant thought. So being able to get into that mind of just focusing on what you need to do when you need to do it, and then switching off is a real skill. And I think if you've got, experienced campaigners in your team as a youngster, you can see that and you can talk to them about that, and the game will hopefully teach you, the most optimum way of being able to concentrate and make it last.
Now, it's interesting you're saying, obviously, Atherton, he's sort of, famous for sort of batting for long periods, and we saw him in many series, obviously, some great challenges and some of the world's greatest fast bowlers. For you to sort of, bat alongside and sort of see him up close, was that sort of a learning experience for yourself as well, as a player and as a coach? Did you sort of take a lot away from playing around plays like that yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're always inspired by people who've done a lot of important things, impressive things in the game. I think the one thing that I talk to coaches about, because my kind of role is kind of developing coaches these days, is actually getting your players to learn from everybody. You can learn something from everybody, and that can actually sometimes be about learning what not to do. So it's very easy for a young player to go, okay, I'm just going to learn from that top player there. Actually, there's something to be learned from everybody, I would say, and I think that's a real skill.
Absolutely, yeah, no, definitely. Sort of, take away what you can and keep developing. And in terms of yourself, so you develop a coach. I mean, what are some of the areas that you sort of help coaches with? I mean, I can imagine sort of communication is a big thing. And I was having a conversation last week, actually, sort of a couple of football coaches, and they sort of talked about sort of saying less in the dressing room with the players, and sort of communication was a big thing. And what are some some of the things you sort of work on with the coaches, Nathan? What are some of the key things that sort of for our listeners or some of our aspiring coaches listening in can maybe sort of take away from your experience?
So I work a lot on. So a lot of coaches are ex-players, especially the coaches that I deal with at the moment, because just because of the nature of the job. A lot of my work is getting them to shift from a playing mindset to a coaching mindset. So they're two very different things. Now, there are obviously transferable skills that you can take from being a player to being a coach, but there's also stuff that gets in the way. So a lot of the attributes that make a really successful performer or a player in any sport, I believe, can be a hindrance as a coach. So an example would be single-mindedness. As a player, you need to lock your eyes onto the target, onto the goal, and be single-minded in your approach to that, and don't deviate from it, and do it your way. Well, as a coach, that doesn't work, because you're working with 10, 11, 15, 20 people. And so you've got to widen your perspective there, because if you go into that environment as a player with that single mentality, that might work for one or two players, but it's not going to work for everybody. So a lot of my work is actually helping them to go from that playing mindset to a coaching mindset, and I think there's a number of things that can help with that. Things like, I think you've obviously got to have domain knowledge. You'll probably get that as a player, but I think emotional intelligence is so important. Kind of raising your level of self-awareness and also the awareness of others. I think you've got to be a skillful manager of people. Be able to adapt your behaviour to get the best of others. I think you've got to. I think you've got to keep your ego in check. That ego really works well for performers, but getting the best out of others, it can be a real hindrance.
No, absolutely, and we're sort of seeing in sort of cricket that some of the the best performers as players didn't necessarily go on to make great coaches, and equally we've seen people who may not have played at that sort of level who've gone on to do really well, and so would you say that the two things are completely different, sort of from the point of view being a successful player or participant is completely different mindset to being a coach?
Yeah, my view is that the longer that you've been a successful player, and the more success that you've had, the more work you've got to do as a coach to get into that coaching mindset. Because if you've been a successful player, then you've probably been playing the game since you were probably 8 or 9 years old, and you've probably finished at 35, 36, 40 years in some cases. That's a long time to be kind of grooving a certain thought process. So that takes quite a long time to kind of reverse that. And I'm a great believer actually in those coaches actually going to do some grassroots coaching, because it kind of widens their perspective very, very quickly. I mean, one of the things that I remember as a player at Lancs was when the club sent me into schools, and to do a coaching session. My ego was decimated very quickly, because I'd go into these schools as a professional sports person, and no one, had heard of cricket, let alone me. All they wanted was a good time. And actually, it took a lot of. It taught me a bit of humility, but it also taught me a lot of management skills and communication skills, like you talked about. And so, if you can do a lot of that, then I think that stands you in really good stead for when you're working with professional athletes as a coach. And I don't think it's any surprise at all that in lots and lots of sports, particularly team sports, the really, really highly effective coaches actually have spent some time, quite a lot of time, dealing with very young players, and actually some of them have actually been school teachers. They've gone into teaching, so there's quite a strong link there, and I think there is something in that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make. I suppose the two things thinking about that is this may be anecdotal. I don't have any scientific evidence to back it up, but certainly a conversation I have with sort of coaches across a broad range of areas is that the world's obviously changed place in terms of the young people maybe in the 90s, for example, may be different to the young people now in terms of dressing room and that sort of stuff. It could be just a perception, but do you think that there's some truth in that where, say for example, the times have changed, the different rules and regulations, it's a different mentality in youngsters than maybe there used to be years ago?
I think there is something in that. I also think that coaching has evolved. Yeah. So, when coaching first came into this country, it was, I guess I was probably one of the first. My generation was probably one of the first generations of cricket players to be coached by professional coaches. Mm-hmm. Those coaches, it was very much a tell approach. I've got the knowledge, and here it is. Do this, do that. Do it to the letter, do it my way. Now coaching is very much so. We talk about push and pull. So that would be pushing information onto a player. Nowadays, a lot of coaching is actually pulling the information from the player. Discovering what they can do naturally. Doing it in their individual way, helping them work it out themselves. And I think we've become much better at working up and down that spectrum. Sometimes you do have to go to a player and say, look, I want you to do this, because they might be a young player, they've never done it before, or time is limited, it's half time and you just need to get your message across. But invariably, if you're wanting to develop people and make them the best that they can be, you need to give them the time to work it out themselves and to find their answers in the best way for them.
Absolutely.
So coaching has evolved, and I think you're right. Society has changed, and I don't think younger generations stand for being told what to do now. I think you need to engage them, and you need to light the fires.
Absolutely, and it's interesting you say. I can imagine for a coach sometimes it can be a lonely place, in the sense that obviously things are going well, everyone's sort of all the accolades come across. When you lose a couple of matches or if things aren't going too well, then you've got like everyone on your back. And on the other side of things, what I was thinking too in cricket, Nathan, this is sort of my observation, and I'm sort of going to run it by you. I have an observation. You're much better placed to me to comment on, to sort of, you're more knowledgeable than me in this area. But one observation I have in cricket is similar to football, where in football years ago, before all the sort of money came into the game, it was a different sort of environment. The money comes in the game, players get a lot harder to manage, so to speak. Now, obviously, the money in cricket isn't the same as it is in football, unless obviously maybe the IPL is, I don't know. But the point being, you've got these sort of big stars now in cricket too, who are well known. We see them on sort of TV. They're household names and that sort of stuff, and it must be hard to manage some of these big names. I mean, how do you sort of, as a coach, go across to say, I don't want to single players out, but we know some big personalities in the game now. How do you sort of go up to sort of these big players and say, well, I want you to sort of, bowl this way, or, it must be challenging for a coach to do that?
I think it's the same as you deal with anybody. You get to understand them first. You get to understand the person first. You get to understand the game. You hear their view, and you wait for an opportunity, if it comes, to pass on what you think. But that's where I think emotional intelligence is so important, because you've got to understand where the athlete is and when the right time to intervene is. Sometimes that can be a long time. These athletes, these high profile athletes are high profile because what they've done for a long time has worked. And so when a coach comes along and says, actually, I've only seen you for 5 minutes, but I think you should change this, often they're going to go, see you later. So, I remember a story about an ex-England coach, a very successful coach, Duncan Fletcher, who won the Ashes back in 2005. Right. When he joined Glamorgan as head coach there, the story goes that he didn't say a word to the players for about a month. But he was just observing, watching, being in the background, and it got to the point where the players were like, "Who is this guy?" I mean, he's the head coach. He's not said a word to me. He's not offered me any advice. But as soon as he felt he was in a position to comment on a player, then he started a dialogue. The player was invariably shocked at how much actually had been stored away, squirreled away. And he was in a really good place to pass judgment, and that actually then created a lot of buy-in from the players, because he had taken his time and put the energy into actually seeing what they can do before rushing to say, actually, I think you need to change this. Players are protective of what they've got, quite rightly. So you don't want somebody coming in with an opinion that isn't measured or calculated.
Yeah, I suppose in saying, I mean, he did a great job obviously for England, would go on to do a great job for England. I suppose in coaching too, do you think sometimes we've sort of seen that around the world where certain coaches have come in, they've done really well for maybe 3 or 4 years, it's almost like cyclical, and then sort of things change, new players come through, it's just a question of maybe change. And do you sort of see it that way, where the game these days it runs in cycles, for players and coaches too, where maybe they get to a sort of point where it probably it is a good idea to move on to a different challenge and freshen things up?
Things certainly go in cycles. I think you've got different coaches for different jobs. You've definitely got coaches who are really good at coming in to a crisis situation and changing things and getting improvement dramatically. But their longevity tends to be quite short, because they tend to be directive. A lot of leaders will talk about actually chaos. In chaos, what the people need is for you to provide clear direction and leadership and say, this is what we're doing. And invariably that gets people out of the crisis. But in terms of longevity, that has diminishing returns, because people fundamentally in good times don't like to be told what to do. And
absolutely,
autonomy and freedom and all that kind of stuff. You've got other coaches who actually don't get success early on, because they're more, their makeup is about development, actually, for the future. It's sowing the seeds, growing relationships, and the success comes further down the line. Now, the trouble with football, I'm not a football expert, so this is an unqualified position, but from an armchair, the problem with football is that I think you get some good managers who just don't get given the time for their results to be, to come through.
Absolutely.
In cricket it's a bit longer, but it's going a bit like that. I think the average for a head coach at a professional county is about 4 years, so it's not a long time.
Absolutely. And then sort of quick, when the results oriented business, that's for sure. And I suppose in sort of youth development, what's the sort of, obviously in first team cricket at county level, be it or international level, it's a results-driven business. But what about in development? What's sort of seen as success in terms of coaching, producing players? No doubt recruitment is a big part in terms of how many players are produced. But what would you sort of define yourself as succeeding at a youth level? Well,
I think it will depend on every environment, because they'll all have their own kind of outcomes that they're working towards. I think a really good indicator for a development coach is that player that you've helped develop at the start of his or her career in the early days, are they still playing 20 years later? One of the things that development coaches I think need to have as a focus is to make sure that their athletes absolutely love the game. We get, in cricket, I think it's even worse in football, but in cricket we have two kind of drop-offs that with youngsters. One at 11, where, participation goes down, and then at 15, 16. And the one at 15 or 16, a lot of it is about expectation from others, and it starts to be about, well, I'm not in the team, or I'm not, produced this score, and as opposed to I'm playing because I love the game. So, I think the most important measure is, have you created somebody, or not created, have you helped somebody develop a love, that's going to last for their entire lifetime? So whether they play until they're 40 and then continue to be a supporter of the game, or, I think that's success. And then if you've got more and more of those people in your network, then, a proportion of those will go on to do really good things. And the more that you've got in that net, then the more people that you'll produce who are really good players.
Absolutely. And in terms of, say, your perspective on England cricket, I know it's obviously difficult to the question to sort of answer, but just with your experience and expertise and having been in the game for as long as you have, and where do you sort of see England cricket going from here? At the moment, there's been a successful last few years. Obviously, like any cricket team now, we're seeing that playing away from home, especially in Test matches, is not easy. England at home is one of the toughest places teams to beat. But in terms of players coming through and the state of the game at the moment in England, do you sort of see the continuation of success at sort of Test cricket and one-day cricket as well?
Well, I hope so. I think we're really good at developing young players and turning them into really good players. In fact, it was fascinating for me, or I found it fascinating. Last year, or maybe 2 years ago, we had a coach developer coming from the FA, and he talked about how in football, England were fantastic at winning youth World Cups, and they went through a phase where they were winning all the World Cups, and we thought, these players are going to go on to great things. Actually, very few of those players went on to do anything in the professional game. He then talked about, for the last few years, England have been absolutely terrible at qualifying for these youth World Cups, and the success that we've had there has been really, really poor. And yet, quite a number of those have been identified as future England players already. In cricket now, it's the opposite. So we've got a terrible record at under 19 level, at youth level. We win like 24-25% of our games, but those players who've kind of lost those World Cups have gone on to win the main events, the big World Cups. So I think we're really good actually at developing the players that we've got, and not getting too hooked up on winning junior World Cups or junior competitions, but winning senior events. I think the issue that cricket has is that maybe that pool is becoming more limited, because more and more players who go into professional cricket are from privileged backgrounds. They go to fee-paying schools, and I think that the thing that we need to kind of improve on is actually widening that pool to make sure that we've got a lot more diversity in our playing population.
Yes, absolutely. Great point. Great, and that's an interesting point. Certainly in football, I think one of the things to sort of consider at youth level is the two things. I don't know if this sort of has any parallels with sort of cricket, but certainly in football, one of the things is I think is that the game has sort of moved more towards development at youth level at the expense of results, which is fine. Obviously you want to develop players, but there's the other side of it too, Nathan. The bottom line is we play sport to win. I don't want to sound like one of them sort of people that it's all about winning at, say, at 5-year-old, but certainly there must be an age where you think, what, we're going to gear these players up. I'm not saying the results should come at the expense of development, but I think certainly in football, what may have happened is the results they moved away the tables and so on and so forth in terms of where you are. And do you not think that at a youth level there has to be that sort of competitive element to learn to win young?
Oh, I think it's got to be competitive. 100% got to be competitive, and I think that youngsters by nature, are competitive and fiercely want to win. And as coaches, we should never ever interfere with that. We need to stoke that competitive edge in our youngsters. However, the problem happens when coaches and managers and the administration people, their focus is on the winning, because then you start making selections based on winning junior matches as opposed to developing the best talent. An example in cricket would be Joe Root. So Joe Root, as a young lad, played for Yorkshire. He was when he was 13 or 14 years old, he was a small lad. He didn't have any power, but he did have mental resilience. He did have a terrific technique, and he had a lot of talent. But when he played for Yorkshire under 14s, for example, he might bat all day, the 50 overs, and score 60 and out, and Yorkshire would lose. And the parents and all that kind of stuff will be saying, we need to drop him. But the coaches at the time said, made the decision, look, do we want to win Yorkshire under 14 matches, or do we want to produce players who are going to win Yorkshire county championship county championships at professional level? And they recognise that actually Joe Root is losing games at under 14 level because he doesn't have the power. But this guy's got something that actually, when he develops the power in a few years' time, he's going to be a world beater. And so their emphasis helps to develop some players in that generation to go on to great things. Now Joe would absolutely have wanted to have won, and it would have been devastated, if he'd caused the loss of his team. But that's where I think we stoke the players' appetite to win and to be competitive. But we need to make decisions based on the development of the player, not the win of the youth team. And there's a difference.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, the analogy I use in football is, say, for example, you can put, an overdeveloped youngster, 6'2", in an under 14 team, and just pump the ball up long, and you win matches. But then at the end of the day, you're not going to develop anybody. So you want to play in the right way. But equally, I think one eye on the results, and encourage the players to get the result, can be a good thing too, to sort of instill that mentality. But the point you made there is really interesting for me. Is that using the football analogy again, is that one of the issues in football, I think, is that when the players are released at about 18, 19 years of age, some aren't mentally and physically mature. Obviously, maturation physically happens sometimes. There's late developers. Mentally as well, maturation happens a bit later too. So what's the situation in cricket in terms of becoming a pro? Because sometimes what happens, we've seen in football, they get released, and if the player doesn't have a high degree of resilience and desire to want to be a pro, and a little bit of luck along the way too, like maybe, not that I knew him personally, but like the likes of a Jamie Vardy who got back in the pro game in football. What's the situation like in cricket there to sort of become a pro, for example? Do they get a bit more time to sort of for the talent to come through?
Well, it's tough in cricket as well. If you haven't been signed, at 17, 18, 19, then it's going to be difficult for you. I mean, I think we're getting a bit better at creating entry points for late developers. We certainly recognise that maturation rates differ, but life gets in the way, doesn't it? If you don't get signed as a 18-year-old, 19-year-old, then you might go to university, you might get a job, and then suddenly you stop training as much and your skill levels, lower, your motivation might be lower. There are some Jim who, desperately still want to, be given a chance, and they'll probably go and play for one of those national counties, those like semi-pro pro teams. And if they do well there, they might get back into the first class setup, the full professional setup, but it's limited. I think it's a real tough one because I was speaking to a psychologist not so long ago, And she was saying that, you know, adolescence actually can last into late 20s. And yet we're making decisions on, you know, 16, 17, 18-year-olds where, you know, they've got a lot more maturing and progressing to do, so it's so tough.
It's a difficult,
you've got to make a decision at some point, I guess.
It's a difficult one because on the other side of things we sort of see, you know, for example, Tim Tendulkar, when he made his, you know, debut, I mean, he's a phenomenal talent, obviously, you know, one in a million or even a billion even, but we saw him sort of burst on the scene, and, you know, certainly we've seen some of the fast bowlers, the great fast bowlers back in the day from Pakistan, some of the, you know, greats, the Yunus and the Shoaib Akhtar, and they sort of burst on the scene. There's the other side too. Do you not think also if you're good enough, you're old enough? And one observation I've got of English cricket, and I'm speaking from the outside, and I might have it completely wrong, but do you think sometimes that maybe players are held back a little bit? Or how do you sort of find, that's a hard decision, how do you find the balance, Nathan, between giving the player a chance, but then obviously you can demoralise a player if things go horribly wrong too? I mean, how does the coach do that?
Well, you only find out about somebody if you give them a go.
Yeah.
So if you give it, I think it's the management afterwards. You know, back in the day, cricket, probably all sport, was absolutely terrible at dealing with people who were given a go and then were dropped. You know, they were given no support, they were just left to fester. And I think we've got much better at that. So, you know, you pick a player, whether they're 19, 20, 21, 22 for England, because you think they're good enough, you know, at that time, and they've got potential to go on. You know, some actually fall at that hurdle. It doesn't mean that they can't come back or won't come back. But I think the key is to look after them, you know, if and when that happens. And I think we've become much better at that. So give them a go, give them the support. You know, if it doesn't work out, I think the stats do show that, you know, those who do make their England debuts earlier actually go on to, you know, become great players in the main, or more of them make the debuts earlier, and that's probably, you know, something to do with actually they know that if it doesn't work out at 21, they can come back and they can go and improve the game. You know, if you make your debut at 27, 28, or 30, and it doesn't work out, then you've got to go back to the drawing board.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people don't have the time or the motivation to get back on. So it does give you the chance to come back, doesn't it, in terms of time?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, exactly. I suppose you've got to have, you know, good people around you as well. I think strong characters around you who can sort of help you as well. I mean, that's a big thing too in terms of player development. I mean, you touched on something that's really interesting, and, you know, this show predominantly sort of goes out in Salford, but we have listeners from around the world who listen to the show, and you mentioned there about recruitment and players getting on board the game, which is interesting for me. So, I mean, are there sort of recruitment drives to sort of get players involved from more urban areas, you know, getting players who sort of may have that hunger to go to the top and see it as an outlet, like we do in football, for example, where it's an opportunity to be able to sort of, like, you know, lift ourselves out of, you know, poverty, for example. Are there sort of initiatives, Nathan, to sort of get players involved in more sort of urban areas as well, or?
Yeah, there are. There's quite a few. I mean, an example would be we've got a South Asian strategy at the ECB that we've had for the last couple of years, and that is to actually, I mean, cricket in Asia is such a big deal. You know, it's like football is to this country, and so we've got a lot of people in this country of South Asian origin who actually go under the radar because they play their cricket, you know, in parks, in car parks, on the street, you know, in less formalised games of cricket, and yet they're talented and they've got passion. And so we've worked very hard actually to create links with the Asian community, to tap into those, to give them opportunities to actually work their way into formalised games of cricket. So there are lots of initiatives. We have a junior initiative, like a primary school initiative, to go into schools that don't play cricket at the moment, you know, and just make it fun. So we've got lots of those initiatives, and we are getting better at kind of trying to broaden the base. But it's such a competitive market, isn't it, these days? Not just in the sporting environment, but so many options for kids these days. It doesn't have to be sport, So
absolutely, yeah.
It becomes tougher, but we are trying our best, I think.
For sure, and sort of, have you seen, sort of any fruits of that labour so far? Have you seen sort of any sort of fruit? I know these things take time, and sometimes they can take a generation or two even to get players to come through. But have you sort of, would you say that programs have sort of helped? Are they going in the right direction, Nathan, or?
They're definitely going in the right direction. Participation is going up in these, in more of a diverse set of areas. But like you said, it takes time to learn your craft, to upskill yourself, to get to the point where you get into the limelight. So I think that's probably going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, where you'll start seeing them kind of come to the fore. But it has to start by broadening your base and getting more people playing the game and loving the game and being giving opportunity. And if we do that, then there will be more who shine as a result of it.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned there the likes of sort of Joe Root, and obviously at the moment you've got in England cricket team you've got huge stars like Stokes, for example, and obviously Anderson's continued success and Broad, and these are sort of household names. And is it important for sort of to have these sort of household names to inspire a new generation? I think the World Cup did a lot for cricket in England and Wales. It sort of inspired a lot of people to sort of look and all of a sudden these names became household names. How important is it to continue this success and sort of not rest on laurels and think, okay, let's go and win another World Cup and let's win the Ashes away, for example? What are your sort of thoughts in those areas?
I think big tournament wins are hugely influential. You look at, if you take India, for example, who have always been cricket mad, but they weren't that bothered about T20. For the first few years that it came into the professional game, and they weren't bothered at all about it. But then they won the T20 World Cup, and suddenly it just went ballistic. And then the IPL came on as a result of that. Conversely, you look at the West Indian team, and you look at the great West Indian teams of the 70s and 80s. There's so many role models there. That if you look at the county game, the professional game in England at that time, there are a lot of Black Caribbean players playing professionally. But you skip on a generation or two, and the West Indies haven't been so successful. Actually, those role models haven't been there, and the numbers have dwindled as a result. So I think it's really important for youngsters to see heroes that are like them. You've got to see it to be it, I guess.
Absolutely, and I suppose you need the infrastructure as well too to make sure you got that sort of pathway to the top. Really, I know that there's been some great developments in this country, and Loughborough, for example, have sort of taken things to a new level, and reinvesting in the game at grassroots is. I mean, how important do you think that is, Nathan, to sort of keep the investment going at grassroots and getting people playing and making sure that things sort of continue, so to speak?
Well, that's the foundation of the pyramid, isn't it? If you don't have grassroots, then the top is going to crumble. It's going to crumble very quickly. So you've got to build. You've got to invest at both ends of the spectrum. But so if you don't invest at either end, top or bottom, then you're not going to have a strong pyramid. So you've got to put a lot of effort, resources, thinking, quality thinking into that grassroots area.
But do you not think also, like, the sort of patience too, where obviously you mentioned the West Indies, that was like a once a 100-year sort of team. We'll probably never see a team like that again, and to sort of have that as a benchmark sometimes. Do you think, I mean, we sort of saw Australia in a similar way as well. You had like this cluster of players all together at one point. Do you think sometimes it's sort of having realistic expectations, saying, you know what, these sort of teams come along maybe once every 100 years if you're lucky, really? Do you think patience is really important too, to say, okay, we can't always be World Cup winners, other teams will have other teams are going to have their moment. Obviously you mentioned India, they're a great cricketing nation. You've got a lot of, these things happen in cycles. And I mean, how important is it that the planning in cycles takes that in consideration, that you might have a period where things aren't going well, but just keep things ticking over?
I think I prefer to replace word patience with being realistic.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be realistic that you're not going to dominate forevermore.
Yeah.
There will come a time when you slump, but I wouldn't. It's important actually not to be patient in terms of we need to make sure that we're doing what we can. We have to be urgent, to get back to where we want to be.
Absolutely, No, great point. Really interesting point. So sort of, keeping things sort of moving along in momentum. But it's been really fascinating speaking to you, Nathan. No doubt that, time's sort of gone really, really quick. I'm sure the listeners have really enjoyed, hearing more. And I think it's really important that we get, people like yourself on the show to increase awareness and participation. Absolutely, to get involved. So I really want to thank you for being on board the Friday Sports Show, 94.5 FM. Yeah, it's been great to have you on board.
My pleasure, Jim. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
It's been fantastic. Been great to have Nathan Wood on board, performance mentor, coach, developer, who's shared his experience. He also works at the England and Wales Cricket Board as lead of specialist in international coach development. Abundance of experience. So, like always, feel free to drop us an email on the Facebook page with any questions, comments, advice about the show. The show is all about increasing awareness and participation. It's been a really fascinating insight. I've certainly found it really fascinating, and know that you have as well. And hopefully, if it inspires one person to get involved in any capacity possible, then it's job done. So thanks for listening to Friday Sports Show 94.4 FM. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.